Hello, and thank you for joining me on another episode of the Tech Exec podcast, where we create world-class engineering teams. As always, I'm your host, Aviv Ben-Yosef, advisor and coach to tech executives globally. And our subject today is Counterstrike, and I'm not talking about the game, but about the strategic concept. Before getting to this week's matters, I want to start with a disclaimer that I do not intend to go into politics. I'm just trying to state a few facts as an interesting background, and if you have an issue with those facts as stated, you can just move on to the next podcast episode. Thank you very much. Alright, Counterstrike. I might be thinking about this too much because as I'm recording this, we are celebrating this week what we call in Israel Jerusalem Day, as we mark 54 years since we have reunited the historic Jerusalem. That is from the Six-Day War in 1967, where Israel took control of East Jerusalem as well. And the Six-Day War is known as a strategic counterstrike, a preemptive action that Israel took as it saw its neighbors preparing to launch an attack. The forces of the Iraqi army were moving into Jordan to be nearer to our borders. Egypt and Jordan signed a military agreement to go into war if one side goes into war. The Egyptians closed off the Straits of Tiran, blocking Israeli access to shipping, which Israel declared as casus belli, or cause of war, and eventually Israel decided to launch a counterstrike preemptively before the other parties started actually firing. And that resulted in what is known as one of the greatest victories Israel has had. And today, now that the history session is done, I want to talk about the same way of approaching issues in our line of work. We have a tendency to try and run away from arguments, from issues, until they become burning problems. We try and pass on the hot potato, hoping it would not land in our hands when it has become too hot. And that is a massive issue, because eventually what happens is that we wait so long and we let problems accrue and accrue, and we let issues become larger and larger until eventually it's not just that we have to address it because it has become a pressing issue. It often means that it has become so big that now addressing it will now require a lot more effort, and some of the damage that was done might not be easily undone or at all. And I get it, we all have so much to worry about. We all have so much work going on. You're spinning a bunch of plates in the air, aren't you? And so you sometimes have to push back things and hope that it might just get fixed by itself one day, that eventually it will no longer be your problem or whatever. You're just hoping to buy some more time. But if that becomes pathological, if that is your default way of treating issues, just postponing everything that isn't an immediate danger, then what you're doing is you're essentially setting yourself up for just having a bunch of emergencies down the road, because you're just waiting on everything to become an emergency. And this is the concept of counterstrikes. How can you preemptively prevent issues? I talk a lot about leadership taking the right sorts of risks. And of course, you shouldn't be addressing everything from the get-go to ensure that you will have no emergencies whatsoever, ever. That is not the right way of taking risks in leadership. Often, you should be just preparing your contingency plan and moving along. But just as not taking any risks at all is not the right way to do stuff, also, you shouldn't just be waiting for issues, for risks to manifest in order to act. Sometimes the best thing to do is to act preemptively, to have your own counterstrike. As an example, I was talking to a CEO who was worried about the growth rate of his tech executive, someone that he valued deeply, someone that he wanted to see grow within the company to a fully executive-like form, not just a glorified manager. But he was worried that the VP would not grow as fast as needed. And when we talked about this, I talked to the VP, the CEO talked to the VP maintained a viewpoint of, things are going okay right now. If we ever get into trouble, let's think about it then. Let's think about getting an advisor or a coach then. Now, I'm biased, of course, because this is what I do for a living. But having seen several times stuff like someone bringing me in 2 months after we had talked because they decided to wait, and in those 2 months they made 2 critical errors that will now take us quarters to fix, like bad hires, like poor strategic decisions. Having seen these a few times, I'm always wondering, what is the source of this tendency to wait, and how can we be more proactive and gain the ability to act on those counterstrikes on time? So going back to that CEO, I eventually told him, if you do not act right now with a way of disclosing what you're feeling and what you're seeing, if you do not provide concise, clear, and candid feedback to help the VP better realize where he is standing, what are the risks that you're envisioning, how you measure these trade-offs to decide whether something should be considered or not. If you do not do that right now, then you also will just be waiting until something becomes a pressing issue and only then addressing it. And pointing that point of view to you, let's consider, what do you have currently on your plate that you're just biding your time with and not acting on, even though acting on it would probably mean that you can solve the issue before it becomes a glaring mistake. As we all know, stating that, for example, a feature has way too much overhead at the sprint planning stage is a lot easier than doing so in a pull request after all the code has been written. The same applies to many of the decisions and changes that you should be making as a tech executive, as someone who has a leadership responsibility and who is the leading persona of an organization. And therefore, I want to think with you, where can you act right now and save yourself a bunch of headaches, issues, and problems down the road? Should you be changing your budget right now to allow for a bigger organization by the end of the year? Maybe you should be argumenting a bit more harshly in the next roadmap session. Perhaps you shouldn't allow your team to roll out that experiment that you can see has a moderate chance of failing, but essentially no real value even if it succeeds. Like the team that decided to have a test and write a microservice in a language that essentially no one knows in the industry and that they have no experience with just because they thought it was cool. You have a moderate chance of failure because they just might blow all of their deadlines by trying to write the microservice in that language. But even if they succeed, what have you gained unless we're talking about an ecosystem that will provide your team with a competitive advantage, that will allow you to do stuff you weren't able to do before, that is actually worth the risk you're taking? You might end up in a year in a situation where you have a bunch more of these microservices written in a language no one uses, all dependent on a couple of coders who wanted to do it, and when those coders eventually want to move on, or when you hire more people who do not have an experience with that specific language, you will eventually end up in a place that's very bad, and you have to pay the price of having let them do it in the first place. A counterstrike might be to say, let's reevaluate how we evaluate this risk and decide whether it's actually worth taking. Yeah, right now you get the quiet of not telling them that they might be doing something wrong at the expense of allowing a big mistake to take place. So for this week, I want you to consider, where can you counterstrike? How can you preemptively stop a mistake before it becomes too late, too pricey, or too annoying? That's it for this week. If you haven't yet, do check out a copy of my book, The Tech Executive Operating System, which covers these kinds of topics and others more in order to create an organization that moves the needle, in order to make yourselves executives who truly and genuinely are executives and not just glorified managers. The early bird period, where you can get extra benefits for purchasing multiple copies, is about to end very soon. Do check out the link below in the show notes. And if you're not following me on LinkedIn, Twitter, whatever, I am sharing a bunch of resources like podcasts I've been guesting on, talks I've been giving, and similar resources because I've been talking a lot about concepts from the book recently. So check that out as well, or sign up to my newsletter. The link, as always, is in the show notes. Thank you, and talk soon.